have no idea.
They've arrested 2 guys, but they haven't said if. I don't think they've charged them yet. But I think they had like 96 hours to charge them, which should be running out soon.
Yeah.
So we should know. But I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that I think they were hired.
All right, good morning, guys. I am not Dr. Miles Smith, as you may notice. I'm Brad Berzer, and it's nice to see all of you. I know just a few of you, so good well, just to let you know, I've been here 27 years, and things have gone well. Generally, it's been a good career, but just in case you don't know who I am, that's who I am. And so it's good to be able to do this. I will tell you, Dr. Smith asked me to lecture on Andrew Jackson and the Indians. I have never given this lecture before. This is totally new to me. So I had to kind of cram last night and figure out what I was going to say today. So hopefully it will be coherent, but you guys can stop me at any point and don't hesitate to ask me questions or anything that you have. Please let me know. So Dr. Smith did ask me to talk about Andrew Jackson and the Indians. So can somebody tell me, what have you guys talked about so far with either topic, Andrew Jackson or the Indians, in this class? Have you done much yet on either? Anybody? Just really quickly. Hi, Anna. Yeah.
Last lecture we talked about how Andrew Jackson was like the new Southern man or something like that. Like
Okay.
The new ideal Southern man, and all the things that went into it, like not being churchy but being religious, but still having like holding that Southern ideals of like, I guess, the frontiers.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll play off that. That's great. Okay, so Andrew Jackson is born in 1767 and he dies in 1845. So these are his years. And Jackson is, as it sounds like Dr. Smith told you, is born into a very serious Scotch-Irish family. And the Scotch-Irish family, they only had 2 sons, Jackson and his brother, but they had just immigrated from Ireland. So if you guys know, the Scotch-Irish are Scots who immigrate to Ireland and then come to America. That's why we call them Scots-Irish. And they ended up not liking Ireland at all. In every way, they hated Ireland. And so they left. It was Northern Ireland, Protestant Ireland, that they had gone to and didn't like. And so Jackson's family had come to America, specifically to South Carolina, and in 1765, so 2 years before Jackson is born. And his dad dies when he's very, very young. And Andrew and his brother then sign up to fight for the American Revolutionary cause on the Patriot side. They fight for America against the British. And there's a moment where Andrew and his brother are captured, and Andrew's only about 12 years old, and he's fighting as a soldier in the American Revolution. And when he's captured, he mouths off to a British officer, which is very Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson did not like authority at all. And so he mouths off to this officer, and the officer throws him on the ground. Oh, the officer's 40, and here's Andrew Jackson, who's 12. And so he throws Andrew Jackson on the ground, and he takes his heel of his boot, and he crushes Andrew Jackson's skull. Actually, knocks in such a point in Andrew Jackson's skull that the indentation, you could take 2 fingers and lay it in Jackson's skull, and you would be flat with the rest of it. That's how deep the indentation was. And that's why if you guys have ever seen images of Andrew Jackson, they always show him turned from the side. We never see the side that was basically destroyed by this British officer. But that's really important for a lot of reasons. But the most important reason is Andrew Jackson absolutely, in every breath he takes, he hates the British. Just adamantly hates them. And so we'll never understand Jackson without understanding that visceral hatred that he has for the British because of what that officer had done to him. And not just to him, but basically they mistreated his brother too, to the point where his brother dies. And so Andrew is left only with his mother, because remember, the father had died young as well. And then Andrew Jackson's mother serves as a nurse during the American Revolution, as a naval nurse. So she goes to the coast and works on a ship as a nurse, and she catches some kind of disease, we don't know exactly what, and she dies as well. So Andrew is left all alone by about the age of 14, and he has to make his way from that point forward. So this, and maybe Dr. Smith, explain this in a slightly different way, so forgive me if it doesn't quite mesh. But Andrew's mother had wanted Andrew to become a Presbyterian minister, and Andrew did not want that. And so he used the money that his parents had left him to go to a liberal arts academy up in the mountains. And so rather than go to seminary to become a Presbyterian minister, he uses that to get a somewhat, he's never good at it, but a somewhat liberal education, a classical education up in the mountains through a relative. And that school works out then for him. It gives him just enough Greek and Latin, not much. He's never good at it, but it gives him enough Greek and Latin to be respectable within society. It would have been very, very difficult to be a gentleman, especially in Southern society, without some kind of liberal education. So it is just enough for him to do that. And he learns just enough Latin to be able to practice law. And so that's what he actually goes into. He becomes a lawyer. And he's a fascinating character. And we have to be really, really careful with him, because I think it's we can easily say he's a bigot. And I don't think that's quite right when we're looking at him. He's too complicated for this. But this is what he does. The moment he practices law, he buys, even though he's single, so this would not have been abnormal for a family, but for a single man, this is kind of odd. He immediately buys a black slave the moment he can afford one. And so this is also a show on his part that he's respectable, because that would have been seen as a kind of upper class move in the South to own a black slave. And so he's only in his early 20s, and he already owns a slave. Even though he's grown up in poverty, he is able to own a slave. And then he and his slave march in very haughtily, with an upstanding kind of respect. They march into Nashville, which is a very young frontier town. And all of this is intentional on the part of Andrew Jackson, because he wants to go into a new town where he can become the elite of that town. And so and I think this is legitimate to say about him, and again, it sounds like Dr. Smith said something similar to this, but Andrew Jackson, when you add up his career, really becomes he will be known as the Knight of Buckskin. That is, he's a very civilized frontiersman. So the Knight of Buckskin is the title that he's given as he goes into Nashville and then goes to war after that. So he ends up marrying Rachel. Rachel, who he adamantly loves. It's one of the great team-ups in American history. His wife Rachel is this brilliant woman. They are madly in love with each other their whole lives. It's a beautiful kind of romance between the two of them. Really similar to, say, John and Abigail Adams, what Andrew and Rachel have. Rachel, though, has a problem, especially given the norms of the day. She had already been married once. And so this was seen legally as adultery in the South. So for her to have already been married and then to marry a second time, they don't recognize the second marriage as legitimate. And this will cause all kinds of problems for Andrew Jackson all the way up into his death, because there will always be pamphlets that are made that talk about Rachel as prostitute because she was on her second marriage. And they also, people who hated Andrew Jackson, also wrote pamphlets that his mother, his sainted mother, he adored his mother, but that his sainted mother was a prostitute as well, and that she had been serving British naval officers as a prostitute during the Revolution. So those kinds of charges, that's the kind of thing, if you say that to Andrew Jackson, he will shoot you. There's no question about that. He will duel you for having said something like that. And almost all of Andrew Jackson's duels, and he's famous for his duels, they almost all result from either the insult of his wife or his mother. And so he fights in a number of different duels over this. But this is all considered very gentlemanly in the South. And I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but I'll explain this for just a moment. Duels in the South were highly ritualized affairs. And only those people who were of the same social class could duel one with another. So Andrew Jackson has already climbed all the way up to the elite, even though he's from poverty and from a Scotch-Irish family. He has climbed his way up into the elite. And so he's regarded as one of the most famous citizens of Tennessee. And so for an equal to challenge him is acceptable. But let's say that you're a 20-year-old upstart and you want to kind of displace Andrew Jackson, and so you challenge him to a duel. Jackson will just ignore you, or he'll come up to you in the street and beat you silly. But he won't kill you, because you're lower class or you're not at the same level. So it would be unacceptable for an elite person to kill a non-elite person in a duel. Does that make sense for everyone? So everything has to be equal. But these duels are almost, to us in 2025, they seem absolutely absurd. So what you do when you duel someone is you pick a second. And your second is the guy who's going to stand next to you during the duel. And in case you're killed, he can finish the job with your enemy. Right? So you always pick a second. But your second also becomes a messenger. So it's the second who delivers an invitation to your enemy to duel. And they always have to be on nice note cards, just like you would do if you were giving a nice thank you note to somebody after high tea. This is what you do with a duel. You write these things out and you deliver them, and then their second delivers back to you, and you always have to negotiate. What kind of weapon are you going to use? Where are you going to meet? How many paces are you going to take? All of these rules go along with the duel, and they're very, very complicated. And we think of a duel because many of us have probably seen Westerns where two guys in a bar just pull guns on each other and start shooting. But in the South, it was highly ritualized. And so again, it could take weeks to set up an actual duel and make it work. One of my favorite, and again, I'll tell you this quickly just because we've got other things to talk about, but one of my favorite duels with Andrew Jackson is Jackson gets crossways with the governor, and they're both elites. Andrew Jackson becomes the head of the Tennessee militia, and the governor is obviously the governor. So they're both elites, and they hate each other. And so they go back and forth with these notes, trying to figure out what weapon, what they're going to do. And for whatever reason, Jackson is really eager for this duel, and the governor is not. So the governor keeps stalling. So Jackson will say, I propose that we meet at 1 p.m. on a Monday afternoon, that we meet in this field and that we fight with this weapon. And all the governor will do is write back and say, I don't agree to your terms. So Jackson has to start all over again. And he's getting really, really frustrated because this is going on for weeks. And so finally, Jackson publishes a letter in the newspaper. And Jackson, remember, he has a liberal education, but he's not great at it. Jackson, and I've had the chance to go through almost all of his writings, Jackson never spells the same word twice in the same way. And so in this thing that he writes in the newspaper against the governor, it is just filled with spelling errors. It's filled with words that don't exist, like gasconade, that Andrew Jackson just makes up. And so the governor responds, and he's really witty. And he says, well, here's my opponent. And he basically copy edits Andrew Jackson's letter back to him. Well, this is the final straw. And so they finally agree that they're going to meet each other in this field, and they're going to fight. And so Andrew Jackson's eager for this, and he shows up. And what they're going to do is they're going to be on horse, but then they're going to dismount and shoot at each other from like 10 paces. And that'll be the duel. They each get one shot. And so Jackson gets to the field, and he's sitting on his horse, and he's waiting, and he's in his full regalia. So he's got his firearms, he's got his sword, everything, because this is a noble moment. And the governor doesn't show up. And he doesn't show up. And he doesn't show up. And Jackson is just getting furious about this, because this is a huge insult to him. And suddenly, over the hill comes the governor on his horse. And he's 25, 30 minutes late. And Jackson is furious, so he pulls out his sword. And it was not to be a duel by sword, but he charges cavalry style the governor, who's so shocked. And Jackson has his sword out, and it's a ceremonial sword. It's not a real sword. And right when he hits the governor, his sword breaks in two, because it's a ceremonial sword. The governor falls on the ground. Andrew Jackson falls on the ground. They both think this is absolutely hilarious. And so they just start laughing uproariously. They hug, and they walk back to town having totally forgiven one another and become great allies from that point forward. So that's insane to think about. That's what a duel was like. And so again, very, very formalized. So they could be very bloody affairs too, but not always. So here's what I wanted to tell you about this, and we'll get to the Indians. There's one moment where Jackson gets into what was called a group duel. That is, he and a gang of men fight another gang of men. And in that duel, Andrew Jackson is shot in the shoulder. And the bullet goes so deep into the shoulder, and it's actually into the shoulder close to so it's more in the collarbone and shoulder than it is in the shoulder itself. But the bullet goes so deep, and it's a lead bullet. It goes so deep that the doctor can't get it out. And so Andrew Jackson, for the rest of his life, suffers from lead poisoning because that bullet is disintegrating in his body the whole time. And amazingly enough, that bullet comes loose in 1845, and it goes into Andrew Jackson's lung and kills him. It's a bullet that he received when he was in his early 20s that kills him when he's in his 60s, which is really amazing to think about that. So the guy who dueled him gets the last laugh in all of that, because that's how Jackson goes. But the point is, when Jackson goes into battle against the American Indians, especially during the War of 1812, he is still recovering from that bullet wound. And the whole time he's on the campaign trail against the Creeks, and I'll go through this in just a second, but when he's on the campaign trail with the Creeks, with the Creeks, when he's on the campaign trail with them, he is in terrible shape. And people who see him all think he's on the verge of death. He's so pale. And his wound has taken so much out of him. And he had spent months trying to recover, but he has to go into battle. Okay, so let's talk about his very complicated relationship with the Indians. So I mentioned a moment ago that it's difficult to call Andrew Jackson a bigot, even though he's a slave owner and even though he fights the Indians. And let me explain why. Andrew Jackson, now, I think we can all agree that without question, slavery is always and everywhere immoral and wrong, right? That we just all agree to that. We know that. But within slavery, there are deep complications and variations depending on the views of the slaveholder. If you guys have ever had the chance, and I highly recommend it, if you've ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin, you know how various those slaveholders could be. Andrew Jackson was, within the context of slaveholding, an extremely kind and just master, to the point that his slaves absolutely loved him. And so that complicates the picture, because again, we know slavery is everywhere immoral and wrong, but within that context, Jackson is regarded as a very kind slave owner. And the slaves would actually weep when he would go off to Washington, or he would be doing something on the campaign trail. They would openly weep when he left, and they would celebrate any time that he came back. And we know that unlike other slave masters, he never slept with his slaves. He didn't mistreat them. In fact, he treated them as family for the most part, even though they were slaves. And we have great testimonies, because when Andrew Jackson died, and this is something that I think is difficult for us to understand, but when Andrew Jackson died, the only American who had a higher reputation than Jackson was George Washington. Jackson was so loved as an American figure by the time of his death. He really was the embodiment of America in the way that George Washington had been in his generation, which is odd for us because I think now we kind of think of him as a second-rate president, but that was not the image of him at the time of his death. And so the reason I bring this up is because all kinds of historians came immediately after Andrew Jackson's death and interviewed his slaves and anyone who knew him, because they recognized what an important figure he was. So we actually have more evidence about Jackson than we do of about any other figure of his day. So Jackson, even though he's a slaveholder, treats his slaves really well. And even though we remember him as an Indian fighter, he is actually very just to the Indians on the battlefield and during treaty negotiations. So much so that in one battle, an Indian child is left on the battlefield, and Andrew Jackson and his wife could not have children. We don't know why. They just couldn't have children. Something biological, most likely. But Andrew Jackson takes this Indian baby and raises him as his son. So this is not the mark of a racist, that you would adopt an Indian child and raise him as your own. It just doesn't make sense if he truly were some crazy bigot about all of this. So all of that really complicates our picture of him. Well, let me give you a couple of names. There are two people in the North, two Indians in the North, who create a massive movement between about 1808 and 1813. And this will be an intimate part of the War of 1812. These two Indians are both Shawnee Indians. And one, the more important of the two, is a prophet. He's an Indian prophet. And his name, you guys have to forgive me, I'm going to spell this out, but it's definitely a complicated name. His name is Tawa. That's the Indian prophet. And I assume that Dr. Smith will be fine if you just call him the Shawnee prophet. That's how we remember him. But his name is Tenskwatawa, is his real name. His brother is a guy named Tecumseh. Tenskwatawa is this fascinating figure because he is an absolute ne'er-do-well within the Shawnee tribe. He is, I'll just give you a couple of stories about him. He was horrible towards women. He treated women absolutely brutally. He was not a good hunter, and I've always tried to figure out how this would actually happen. One time when he was on the hunt, he shot his bow and arrow backwards and he blinded one of his eyes. He destroyed, I don't even know how that would be possible, but somehow he did. He was an alcoholic, a raging alcoholic, drunk most of the time. And around 1808, everybody assumes he's dead. He falls into, for all intents and purposes, a coma. And they're about to bury him, and he wakes up, which freaks everybody out, you can imagine. Right, so he wakes up, and when he wakes up, he tells this crazy story that sounds just like Dante and the Divine Comedy. And he says that he has now traveled through all the places of death, and he has seen what heaven looks like. And he describes it, and he actually describes something that sounds very much like purgatory, as well as something that sounds very much like heaven. And he claims that he has met the maker of all things. He's met God. And that God has told him how to unify the Indians to fight the whites. And amazingly enough, he is cured, not of his blindness, but he is cured of his alcoholism. He never, ever takes another drop of alcohol for the rest of his life, even though he had been a raging alcoholic. And truly, all the Indians believe this is a man who has been completely reborn through this divine experience. And frankly, from all the evidence, I can't counter that. Something absolutely did change during that coma. He is a very different man afterwards. Well, he starts then as a great prophet, and all of these Indians, not just Shawnees, but almost all the Indians of the Great Lakes region, so all the Indians of Ohio, Indiana, bless you, and Illinois and Michigan and Wisconsin, they all start seeking out the prophet. And so he creates a town called Prophetstown. It's where Lafayette, Indiana is today. So he creates this huge cosmopolitan Indian center, and there are Indians, pan-Indians from everywhere. Well, his brother is the best warrior of his generation, his brother Tecumseh. And Tecumseh recognizes that this religious movement could really become a powerful counter to white expansion. And so what Tecumseh does is he begins to create what's called a Northwest Confederation. That is, he begins to ally all the Indians militarily one to another. And then he goes up to Canada and he gets the British to arm all of these Indians. So the British will pay for all the weapons. They even give Tecumseh a commission. I can't remember what his rank is. He's a major or something in the British Army. And from that point, he starts organizing all of this. Well, Tecumseh also makes a trip down south. And when he makes a trip down south, he meets with a number of Indians in Alabama called the Creeks. So I'm going to pause for just a moment and explain something here about Southern Indians. There are 5 major Indian tribes in the South. And I would guess that Dr. Smith would want you guys to know these 5. So I'll list them here. There are the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminoles. They're in Florida. So these are what are called, and it's not very politically correct, but it's what we call them. They're called the 5 civilized tribes. And that's how they're always known. These are the 5 civilized tribes. And what that means is that all of these tribes, with only a slight exception, all of these tribes have tried to become European. That is, they have struggled to become European. And what that means is they have all started writing down their language. So they create what are called, and you guys don't need to know this, but they're called syllabaries, which is basically like a dictionary, but a translation of Indian languages. They write down their languages. They've all adopted constitutions. They're all republics. Each one of these tribes has created its own republic, just like, and they're imitating the states. They're trying to look like they're states within states in the way that they created these republics. And interestingly enough, and this is something that historians don't often talk about because it's not convenient, they all adopted slavery as their institutions as well. So in fact, these 5 tribes owned far more black slaves per capita than whites did in the South. And they make a lot of money. These tribes all do extremely well. The first 4 here, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, and Chickasaw, are almost completely intermarried with the Scotch Irish. So you'll meet Creek chiefs named Ross or McAndrews or McDonald or McConnell, because they've all married into these Scotch Irish families. And it's very difficult to separate the Indians from the Scotch Irish because of how intermarried they are. But the Creek are an exception even among these 5, because the Creek are divided into what's called the Upper and the Lower Creek. They have a civil war during the War of 1812. The Creeks had a civil war. The Upper Creeks are allied to Tecumseh and want to be a part of this pan-Indian anti-white federation. And the Upper Creeks then make sure that everything they're doing is all based on their own native, non-European traditions. And so we call this, the term that's used is nativism. That is, they are trying to be what they were pre-contact. That's not going to be possible. In fact, it's a noble but ridiculous assumption that they can do this. They're already too acculturated to Europeans for this to happen. But they create a kind of fake nativism. They believe it's real, but it already incorporates so much. So the Creeks go into open warfare against each other. They're truly having a civil war. Andrew Jackson then comes in, and this is where it just gets so complicated and crazy. Andrew Jackson raises a force in Tennessee. Technically, Andrew Jackson's commission to be a military officer comes from Tennessee and not from the U.S. government. So here he is, a commissioned officer. He's a major general in the Tennessee militia, meaning he's in charge of it. But he doesn't have enough men. And here's where it gets really complicated. Andrew Jackson adamantly hates the idea of conscription for any soldier. And so he will only allow soldiers in his army who have volunteered. He will not allow any soldier who has been pressured into fighting to fight for him. He believes that's completely un-Republican to do that. And it's a violation of America and the American spirit. So that means that he has to recruit all kinds of people to fight with him. And here, again, is where it gets crazy but fascinating. Jackson is able to get a number of black soldiers to fight with him. Some who are still enslaved but want to give up their slavery, others who are freed, but he recruits a huge number of blacks for his army. And then he goes to the Indians, and he recruits a huge number of Indians for his army. So he is actually able to raise a military force of about 3,100 soldiers. And it's pretty evenly divided between 3 groups of people. It's divided between white Tennesseans, almost all of whom belong to the Masonic Lodge, the Freemasons in Tennessee. And then he's got a huge group of blacks and a huge group of Indians. And he goes to war against the Upper Creek because of this division. So the Lower Creek had wanted to be civilized in the sense that they would have used it at the time, that is, become Europeanized. The Upper Creek are allied with Tecumseh, and they want to remain nativist. Does that make sense for everyone, that division? So Jackson goes to war with his small force. The U.S. military, and I always love this is how complicated American history is. The U.S. military is very, very frightened of Jackson's private army running around in the South. And the U.S. government orders Andrew Jackson to disband and to move all of his troops under regular army control, that is, by the U.S. government. Jackson believes that's an absolute violation of the American spirit, and he countermands that order and refuses to acknowledge the U.S. government's law on that. And he maintains his army, and thank God he did, because he changes the world, and we'll see why. But here's what his army does. They go to war against the Creeks. The Creeks are a very, very powerful ally, but they all meet. Andrew Jackson is able to get them to meet at what is called the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. So remember, he's got his private army. He's at Horseshoe Bend. And Horseshoe Bend is, and I'll just kind of try to explain this. This is a huge bend in a river, and a good-sized river. And so what the Indians do is really smart. What the Creeks do is they put themselves in the bubble of this bend, knowing that nobody can cross the river and attack them. So they're basically protected on about 75 to 85% of their village, and they're only exposed on the extreme northern part of the village itself because the river's protecting them. And what they do then is they create a whole series of barricades on the northern part of the village by using fallen trees. So they've cut the trees down and they've created these immense walls and barriers against Jackson. Jackson's really impressed. So impressed that he'll use the same technique against the British in the Battle of New Orleans within just a year. So he's very impressed with what the Creeks have done. But Jackson also has serious artillery. And so what he does is he uses his artillery to just pound the barricades and pound the village. And once he's reduced them to basically nothing, he invades with his infantry. And so they're able to attack the village, go into hand-to-hand combat. It's brutal, but Jackson's men win. And so this is one of the great victories of the War of 1812, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, that Jackson is able to conquer the Upper Creeks. When he does so, and this is where the consequences for this are huge, the Upper Creeks had all claimed control, and had actually had real control, over half of Alabama. Half of Alabama was under Creek control. Jackson, by defeating the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend, is able to force those Indians into giving all of Alabama half of Alabama to the United States. And so it's one of the largest land transfers in American history. Half of the state is given up by the Indians and given to the Americans. So a massive, massive victory. And what this means, I don't know how much you guys have talked about the War of 1812, but in the War of 1812, the British are so thick in the Great Lakes area, and even here in Hillsdale. This was a Potawatomi village. Bobbice was the village. And all of this area was very much controlled by the Indians who were allied with the British. The same thing the British tried to do on the Gulf Coast, but this prevents them from doing that. Jackson, by disrupting the Indians, makes sure that they will never have the power in the South that they have in the Great Lakes. And so that there's no major victory in the South by the Indians because of Jackson. And remember, it's his private army. Then, and this is what's stunning, Jackson takes his army to New Orleans. Nobody knows New Orleans is going to be hit. Andrew Jackson decides if the British invade America, they'll do it by coming up to New Orleans. Andrew Jackson takes his army, remember, a private army. These guys have no legal status at all. It is a private army that Andrew Jackson takes down to New Orleans, and he fortifies New Orleans just like he had seen the Creeks do at Horseshoe Bend. He creates all kinds of trenches, all kinds of barriers, and when the British, who amazingly invade on January 8th of 1815, when they invade, they outnumber Jackson's troops by about 10 to 1. They have a 10 to 1 advantage, but Jackson is so dug in that he just decimates the British Marines as they leave their boats and jump into the Gulf and invade New Orleans. Just decimates them. So much so, and I think I've got this number right. I may have this not quite right, but close. There's something like 440 men who are so blown to bits by Jackson's militia that they never recovered any of their body parts at all. Just stunning what Jackson is able to do. Jackson only loses 11 men in the invasion of New Orleans. It's incredible. It's one of the most lopsided battles in world history. Jackson just has this clear defeat of the British there. But again, it's that private army, and I can't stress that enough. After the War of 1812, Jackson, of course, is now always known as the hero of New Orleans. And the only title that rivals that is Father of Our Country. All right, so Jackson, after New Orleans, becomes the second greatest American to have ever lived, because only Washington is greater. And then what happens after the War of 1812, the government, all they can do is praise Jackson. They can't rein him in. He's got his private army. Jackson moves that private army into Florida in 1816, and between 1816 and 1818, Jackson wages war, again privately and without the consent or direction of the U.S. government. He wages war against the Seminole Indians and the Spanish and some of the British agents who weren't supposed to be there, all in Florida. So we call these, between 1816 and 1818, we call these the Seminole Wars. And I'm going to be politically incorrect for a moment, and so hopefully you guys will forgive me, but again, it's just how things were at the time. Of the 5 civilized tribes, the Seminoles were about the only one that didn't practice slavery in the way that the other ones did. And so the Seminoles, rather than enslaving blacks, actually welcomed blacks into the tribe. And so Southern blacks who were escaping slavery would flee into Florida, and the Seminoles would bring them in as equal members of the tribe. So they have a leader, the Seminoles do. They have a leader, and crazily enough, his name is Nero. I always think that's hilarious. But the head of the Seminoles is named Nero. And Nero has fortified his people. And this is where it's not politically correct, but it's just what they called it. Because this was a group of blacks and Indians together, they called this Fort Negro. That was the main base of operations for the Seminoles. And Jackson, again, using his private army, is able to defeat the Seminoles over 2 years. And not only that, but he is also then able to kick out the Spanish who owned Florida. And so we get Florida between 1819 and 1821. Florida becomes our possession. So let me just kind of end with this, because I find it fascinating. So James Monroe is president during all of this Seminole War. James Monroe is president. And his cabinet is deeply divided on what to do with Andrew Jackson. Remember, Jackson is illegal. He's got his own private army. He's running around without the consent of the U.S. government. He's attacking the Spanish. He's attacking the Indians, all without the consent of the U.S. government. And so Monroe's administration debates endlessly what to do with Andrew Jackson. And the forces within Monroe's administration are deeply divided between two figures. You have the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, who absolutely hates Andrew Jackson and wants nothing more than to send down a larger force of American soldiers to capture and execute Andrew Jackson for treason, for having a private army. But on the other side, you have the Secretary of State, arguably the greatest Secretary of State we've ever had in American history, John Quincy Adams. He's a terrible president. He was the best Secretary of State. And John Quincy Adams says all the time, "Are you guys crazy? Jackson is the greatest godsend ever to the United States. We don't want to rein him in. We want him to keep going, because every time Andrew Jackson attacks, we gain territory." And so that's ironic, because if you know the history of the 1820s, John C. Calhoun will become Andrew Jackson's running mate and become vice president under Andrew Jackson. And John Quincy Adams will become the number one enemy of Andrew Jackson, because they run against each other in 1824 and hate one another. So I would actually, and I would go this far, and I'm probably speaking as Brad more than Professor Verzer for a moment, but I would say this, that one of the greatest alliances ever in American history was John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And I think if they had remained who they were as a team, we could have been unstoppable in the 1820s. They were, and it's truly unfortunate that they had that falling out. But you may also know this, Andrew Jackson's president, he knew nothing about John C. Calhoun wanting to execute him. John C. Calhoun is his vice president, and one day Andrew Jackson is going through the old letters of the previous administration, and sure enough, he comes across the note that says John C. Calhoun wanted him executed for treason. And so, of course, what does Andrew Jackson do? He forces John C. Calhoun out of the vice presidency right away. Can you imagine knowing your vice president wanted to kill you? That would be not good, right? So that he removes Jackson, he removes Calhoun from the vice presidency. Okay, you guys have any? That's what I wanted to talk about today. We've still got about 2 minutes. I'm going to feel guilty if we end 2 minutes early. It's a waste of your tuition dollars. Yes, thank you.
So you mentioned Jackson had a private army. Where is he getting like all of his artillery from?
Yeah, so mostly being paid for privately. Jackson's very wealthy, and so he's able to raise that privately. But he also has a number of donors throughout the South who are supporting what he's doing. And so, and again, just to show you how extreme Andrew Jackson is about this, Andrew Jackson is inaugurated on March 4th of 1829 as President of the United States. He absolutely forbade any member of the U.S. Army, officer or enlisted, to be at his inaugural. He did not allow it. He hated the Army. He hated them. But every militiaman in America was welcomed. Isn't that, I mean, it's fascinating to think about that. Not our normal understanding of history, but really amazing. Jackson just believed it was a Republican duty that men were well armed and that they formed their armies. That's what you're supposed to do in a republic. So, good. Anybody else? Thank you. What's your name?
Emery.
Thank you. Good. All right. What should we call it a day? Yeah? Good. Okay. Thanks, guys. Good meeting you all. Thanks for letting me bloviate for 50 minutes. Yeah. Thank you, guys.